Hello, y'all. Christian White, the One Day at a Time Dad, presenting Listening to Learn, a series designed to discover solutions to community issues through the voices of lived experience. I'm here with Mr. Eddie Crispin. A pleasure.
Yes, sir.
For many reasons. First of all, how did you grow up? What was the inside environment and the outside environment like?
So I grew up in Mattapan. Came here at 7 from Haiti. Immigrant family. Very, very strict.
First of your family?
Yeah, my father came here when he was 28, and I came, when I came here 7 years later, he was 35. So my father was first generation, came here, didn't know a single person, and kind of set himself up and sent for the kids. Yeah.
And what type of work did he do when he was here?
So my father worked 3 jobs. He worked as a welder, he worked as a dishwasher, and on the weekends he would take me with him, and he would go clean banks, and I would go with him. So he worked day and night, but I always knew that if I got in trouble, he'd find 10-15 minutes to set things straight.
What kind of character was he?
He's hardcore West Indian, all about the work, very strict, and probably not very emotional, or not very lovey-dovey, if you would, with the kids. But, you know, I'm going to feed you, I'm going to clothe you, there's certain expectations I have. You're going to go to school, and you will not go out in public and embarrass me for any reason.
Interesting. Yeah. So what was your mom like? So
my mom, I came here, my mom, I sent for her when I turned probably like 32. After I got out of law school, I sent for her. So my mother was always in Haiti. I grew up with a stepmother, and my father.
Oh, okay. You know what? I was assuming that he left the family and then brought the whole family. No. Oh, I didn't realize they weren't together.
So when I came here, my father was married. So he also had a kid with her. That's a whole different story. But yeah, so he was already here with my stepmother, sent for me at the age of 7. And I think when I came here was the first time I actually met my father.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, yeah.
What was that experience like?
Odd.
This is not an emotional man if you haven't figured it out yet.
It was odd and traumatic, because I came from a home where my mother in Haiti had babied me. And I come into this world where I'm in a house with 2 strangers. I'm not getting the kind of what I call mothering, smothering that I was accustomed to. And I suffered. The first year I was here, they ended up sending me back because I couldn't go to sleep. I was crying at night because I missed my mom. Yeah, so.
And how old were you when they were talking about sending you back?
So I was here for probably about a year. I spent a year of school here. And
so that was a hard adjustment.
Yeah. So they sent me back, but I loved it because I was back home with my mother. I didn't have all the American things. Haiti, as you well know, is probably one of the poorest countries in the world.
Yeah.
But for me, that didn't matter. I was home with my mother. I was getting all the love and all the affection, and I could jump up and down on the bed, and I got to decide what I ate every day. So for me, that was wonderful.
Are you a dad?
I am.
How many children do you have?
I have 2 boys, 22 and 6, and soon to be 17.
Are you just like your dad in regards to the emotional?
You know, no, I try to be better. But I think inevitably, some of the things that we dislike about our parents the most, we find ourselves emulating. So I go really hard and I tell my son every night that I love him. I'm sure I could be better in showing emotion, but it's something that I work on. I think we are all byproducts of the world that we grew up in, and we have to fight hard to change who we are and how we engage the world, and especially our kids.
Yes,
especially our children.
Especially them. Yeah. So you move. So you go back to Haiti. Yeah. You come back, and then what do you do?
I come back after a year, and right back in school. So my home life was a little different because of my stepmother. We had a classic stepmother relationship. So
you didn't get any emotion from her?
No. Okay. And my father was always working, so he wasn't privy to some of the stuff that happened. But shortly thereafter, I ended up moving in with my uncle, who got married, and that was a little bit more of a stable situation for me, you know. But I I always went to school. I love school. School was my escape. I read a ton of books. The one thing I always did growing up, I love reading.
Yes.
And for me, it was huge because my mother doesn't read or write, and she puts an X. But the one thing she really impressed upon all her kids was that we were gonna read. We were gonna go to school. So at the age of 5, I was already reading, despite growing up in a household where my mother didn't read.
So who taught you to read?
She had people coming over. She sent me to school.
Okay.
And school in Haiti is very rigid, very structured, very rigid, very disciplined. So, and at an early age, there's very little public education at that time.
Yeah.
So people who are poor, barely making ends meet, they have to decide: am I going to send my kid to school, or am I going to buy food? So if you go to school, you're not doing well. Generally, you're not there for long. And the school system there is, from the time you're in kindergarten, if there's 30 kids in the class, somebody's number 1 and somebody's number 30.
Oh, and does that determine who gets what resources in the school? If there's any resources?
There are no resources. That determines whether or not your parents want to keep investing their money and sending you to school.
Okay.
Yeah, especially if your parents have very little means.
So I'm curious, at that time, was there free lunch and stuff like that? No. I assumed.
Well, in the United States or in Haiti?
In Haiti.
Well, I don't.
I assume not.
Yeah,
I just was okay.
I don't think to this day there's free lunch. They actually have a few more programs now, but that thing, free lunch, was non-existent. It did not exist in Haiti. And had it existed, I'm sure people would have made more of an effort to send their kids, because a lot of people, when you talk about food deprivation,
yeah,
a lot of parents there don't wake up in the morning, don't know whether or not they're going to feed their children.
Yeah. Yes, I get that. I went through that.
Yeah.
So you live and your uncle lived in Mattapan as well?
Yep, we did. We grew up in Mattapan.
What was the environment like?
So I will say it was very much of a community-oriented environment, because I think at the time I lived on Delhi Street. Yep. And the bulk of Delhi Street were Haitian families who knew each other from Haiti. So it was like a small little community, and that was good, and it was bad, because as a kid, if you did something, somebody would inevitably call your parents and tell them. So it was good in that way. It was nurturing. It was good to walk down the street and everybody knew your mother, your father, your uncle. So, in that way it was good. But I think the environment also, for me, at the time, and I came here in '76, there was a very much of an anti-immigrant sentiment amongst a lot of African Americans. Back then they call them Negroes, So people attempted to bully me. I was always that kid. I would fight. Yeah. And unfortunately, my father didn't realize fighting was part of what I had to do. So I would fight in school, and I'd come home and get disciplined for fighting in school. Got it. So in that way, I think that was just a factor of people not understanding. People who look different from them, who dress different, who had grown up differently. And I look at today's world, we've come so much further, because I see people now proudly claiming their immigrant status. So in that way, there's been some major changes. Absolutely.
So what do you do for work now?
So currently, I'm a police officer. Have been for 21 years with the Boston Police Department. Currently assigned to the Community Service Office.
And what does that mean exactly?
So the Community Service Office, we don't take any 911 calls. So most of the work that we do is community oriented. We have a community service officer who does all youth programming. Okay. We have a senior service officer who does all programming with seniors in the community. We have 2 other officers who engage the community in many different ways. So let's say you call and say, hey, my neighbor next door has huge parties every weekend. They're serving alcohol, they're playing loud music. For me, or one of them, we'd go and knock on that person's door. Mr. Smith, Mr. John, Mr. Pierre, whatever. We've been made aware that you're having these parties, and obviously it's affecting the quality of life for your neighbors. Yes. So this is who I am. I'd prefer that you take care of this situation so that we don't have to come back. It doesn't end up being in court. And for the most part, that works. We also go to community meetings where people want to know what's happening in their communities. We'll tell them about crime reports. We'll tell them about things that they can better secure their homes, how they can create crime watch groups. So we do all those things. We give books away.
Is
notebooks.
The aim of programs like that for people to report more crime, to maybe trust police more? So if I guess what I'm asking is if things like helping them set up crime watch, things of that nature, I'm assuming that's to report crime.
I think it's to report crime, build relationships, right? I think the one thing that people oftentimes don't realize is that when you build relationships with people, that there are a lot more things that may be said. It may not be in the reporting it to the police, but in terms of casual conversation. The other piece is that we are able to solve problems that don't necessarily end up in court. Like the situation I told you where, normally we'd go write a report. We'd file charge against the person for keep of a disorderly house, right? And maybe it's the landlord, or report him to ISD. Most of the times we're able to resolve these situations. Even if it's for a short period of time and then it resurfaces a year later, we're able to address a lot of these situations. I think for me, like with the seniors, a lot of them at home. A lot of times their kids are not engaged and involved with them and taking them out. We have this senior officer who will go pick them up, take them shopping at malls. She does an exercise program with them during the summer where they walk inside the CAS center. They've done baking and sold their stuff right at the station. So for me, it's really about building relationships. And then the other part, taking care of problems that don't necessarily have to end up in front of a judge or clerk magistrate.
I mean, why is it important? I mean, I kind of look at that as, even though you're responding to a call, it's proactive on another. I look at that as crime prevention over the long haul. Why do you think it's important, I guess, to build that relationship instead of just, because I'm assuming you could show up at the scene, you could hear the music, and right there, that's probable cause in conjunction with the call that's made. Why not just arrest everybody?
So I think at the end of the day, we can't arrest our way out of these problems, right? And I think for me, what we do, I always feel like I'd rather have a conversation with you as a man to man, like, or man to woman,
I get exactly
whatever it may
mean.
be, right? So for me, I'm like, if I knew I was doing something wrong and somebody approached me and said, "Hey, Eddie, cut the BS," this is how it's affecting people. And if I'm thoughtful enough to come out and knock on your door, most people are going to be receptive enough to say, "Okay, I understand. I'm going to try to stop." We've dealt with people in that way about fireworks, when the fireworks were going off.
Yes.
So for me, we try to deal with these problems in a way that doesn't necessarily entangle people in the criminal justice system or flood the courts with stupid stuff, which to me at the end of the day, I say stupid stuff, but things that could be dealt with outside of the criminal justice system.
Totally understood. So I happen to know that you're the president of MAMLEO right now.
Yes.
Which, hold on, Massachusetts, wait, hold on, I got it. Massachusetts Association of Minority Law Enforcement Officers.
There you go.
Got it. I suck at that.
You got it.
I suck at that.
It's long.
Why was that created? What was it out of necessity? What does it do? Why are you a part of it?
Okay. So MAMLEO was created in 1968 in an effort to really push for black men. At the time, it was I think they tried to recruit some Hispanic officers. It didn't quite work out. They ended up filing a lawsuit. As you are well aware, in the 68, 70, that was in the height of the civil rights movement. And I think everybody kind of came to the conclusion, you know what, if we are able to hire people who look like the neighborhood, who are from the neighborhood, then chances are the policing will be a lot better. But the police department didn't always buy into that. So these men and women sued the police department.
And these were officers? All officers. Okay.
And actually not all officers. Some of them were civilians. Who
all right. That's what I was wondering.
Who were trying to get into the police department. They sued.
And
successfully won.
Got it.
But the crazy thing is this, Christian. When they won, it was under this idea of hiring minorities.
Yes.
So the police department, rather than hiring black men and brown men, they hired all white women.
Because that's a minority under the definition.
Yes. So they subsequently had to go back into court.
And is that intentional?
Listen, there's no way that cannot be intentional.
Okay, I'm glad you said that. Like, it just, because it just seems so blatant. That's kind of what I mean.
That's what it is. So, you know, they ended up suing, and not only within Boston, but Milton also. We have a member of Mamleo who was the first black officer in Milton. You know, so a lot of these departments were then put under a consent decree. Boston Police being one of them. That consent decree basically said for every 2 or 1 white police officer you hire, you have to hire a black officer.
Yes, and this is specifically a black officer at this point.
Yes,
not a minority.
Yes.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. You know, so that was the beginning of Mamleo. At the time, it was called Massachusetts Association of Afro-American Police Officers. It's been since changed to Minority Police Officers. So from its inception, that was the idea, was to get more black men and brown men into policing. Now our job is, to some extent, the same.
Yes.
We are pushing for recruitment of more minority police officers. If you look at the Boston Police Department, I think we're like 22 or 23%. But sometimes that's not always visible.
Well, and by 22, 23%, do you mean African American specifically?
Hispanic,
or is it mixed? Oh, so we're still way behind.
Yeah, we're still way behind where we should be.
Got
like
it,
for me, when you look at especially a place like Roxbury,
yep,
where it's predominantly black and brown people, and you look at the police officers who are assigned here, whether it's by accident, we just do not look like the community. Especially on the night shift. Yeah, so I think we have to be more intentional. And by no means am I suggesting that we should have all black and brown officers assigned to B2. But it's important that if there's a call and there's 20 police officers, there's not 1 or 2 people of color. That people can see themselves, and oftentimes that has a lot of value. And I'll tell you a brief story. So just the other night, there's a young man that was stopped. His car matched the description of a car that had been involved in the shooting. And I happen to know this young man because I used to work in DYS years ago. And the majority of police officers there happen to be white. Now, not to say that they weren't going to be fair and treat him the right way. And I was like, all right, well, it looks like you're going to be all set. I'm going to leave. And he says to me, look, I'd appreciate it if you just hung around. So it's a certain comfort level. Yeah. And I ended up sticking around, and, you know, till everything was over, I gave him a pound, gave him my card. I said, hit me up if you need anything. So those type of things for me are still very important. So above and beyond doing the pushing for more minority recruitment, for years, Mamleo was able to track and find out that officers of color were being disparately punished.
Let me ask, the tracking of that, was this through Mamleo or the Boston Police Department?
Through Mamleo. Through Mamleo.
Okay.
So we know that. We also know that we weren't getting transferred to the desirable units.
Interesting.
And there were some issues as far as promotion also. So I think we are now in a place where we are better able to address that, because the man we have at the helm is a man who has the perspective of a black man. People may not be happy with everything he does and says, but I think for me, being the first in that position, he's someone I can go knock on his door, say, hey, Commissioner, let me talk to you. These are my concerns. Whereas I don't know that we were always able to do that.
Got it.
So we're in a better place.
And what is Mamleo doing now, especially during COVID and things of that nature, to continue to push that mission of bringing in more minority officers? So
we have 2 attorneys who are assigned to our office. We found out over the years, a lot of minority police officers or recruits were being bypassed for one reason or another, oftentimes unfairly, whereas their white counterparts were...
What would being bypassed look like?
So you start going through the process and they say, hey, Eddie, you got arrested when you were 17 or 18. So I don't know that we can let you go through the process, so we won't accept you to go into the next class. And then we found out that there were certain trends that existed for years prior to this administration. There was a psychologist who was hired by the police department who did psych evaluations. Turns out that this psychologist was routinely pointing out quote-unquote psychological issues that should preempt somebody from being a police officer, right? And a lot of these people, I know one young man who got bypassed because he had children with 2 different women, right? As crazy as that may sound, there are people who are making assessments of you who have cultural biases, And to some extent,
I know plenty of men and women would that did okay. That's
listen. So all that to say, we continue to fight a lot of fights. Luckily for me, I was able to push some of our agenda by virtue of being on this task force that the police, the mayor appointed. So we've pushed some of our issues: recruitment, diversity. So for me, at all different levels, like one of the things I've suggested, and and I've been suggesting this for a few years now, I was able to get it into one of the recommendations, is we should put a preference in for Boston Public School graduates, right? If we really talking about diversifying the department, and we look at Boston Public Schools as a whole, it's probably 85% people of color.
Yep.
So not only do we get these kids who grew up in the city to come onto the police department, they know the neighborhood, people are familiar with them, they now are doing the job and better, right, than people who are not from the department. Again, there's some very good cops who didn't grow up in the city, but for me, I'm always going to say, look,
but the person you can relate to is going to be the person you'll typically.
I roll up in Mattapan, and where I grew up, and I see people I know.
I can imagine.
They'll be like, "Oh, that's Ed."
Yes.
And familiarity is a great thing. I was just in Orchard Gardens a few months ago, and I ran into a kid that I knew from when I was at DYS. He was like, "Yo, that's my man Ed. Y'all, Ed, you cool?" He's like, "Listen, this is my man." So those type of things have a lot of value in the work that we do.
Absolutely. What do you view as, like, why don't I see plainclothes men, women, uniformed men, women walking up and down these streets, engaging people with nothing to do about police work, but just talking to them?
I think that's a tough thing. I think learning how to engage people, especially when you're wearing the uniform, is a tough thing. There are people, just by virtue of the uniform you put on, you are the enemy. And not everybody is socially is social enough to understand how to engage and take on people, whether they be whether they be black, white, rich, poor. I think it's an acquired skill, and you have to really work hard to hone that skill. So I think that's one of those things that we push people. And in this environment that we're in, I think a lot of police officers are kind of wary. Like, you know, I've said good morning to people, and they've said F you. Right? So there are people who embrace us and who want us in the community, but I think it's important that, for me, I always tell young officers, more people want us here than those that don't. So we have to do a better job of walking around and learning that police work is a lot more than responding to 911 calls. And I think there are people who do that, who do a great job of doing that. There are people who are still uncomfortable, because the nature of policing is that most interactions are going to be confrontational. You know, I get calls.
But is that something that, so when you go through training, or I guess throughout the career, are you taught that the community is different than you are?
No, I don't. Nobody ever says that, but I think in some ways, some people develop the mindset that, you know, I'm the cop and this is the enemy. And I'm not saying that there's a lot of people who see things that way, but there are some people who develop this idea. Because if you go to a couple calls, like within 3 months on the job, you go to a couple calls, and all of a sudden people are judging you just based on the uniform that you wear. You're like, man, I didn't do anything to you. I just showed up. Those experiences can substantially affect the lens that you continue to see people through for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. You know, and I think for me, one of the things I've done as president of MAMLU is really try to have conversations with some of the younger officers and let them know, like, look, people want you there. Whether or not there are some politicians who say, you know, we don't want the police in our neighborhoods. When I go to community meetings, Christian, there are people who love the police.
Well, the first time I ever I didn't meet you then. The first time I ever saw you was when, it was an unfortunate occasion. Liz Miranda was running for office at the time. And I think a young man was murdered on Itasca Street.
Yes.
And there was a woman who was talking about her personal experience with it. And then I heard you talk, and it was interesting because I remember you were talking, you were saying something about, I can't remember exactly, but it was kind of your kind of tough stance position, where it was like, well, we need to do this, young people need to do that. And I remember thinking, he lives in the neighborhood, but he didn't go through exactly what I went through, which is fine. But I remember initially I felt biased towards you, but you were still a cop. Like at this point in my evolution, I was still...
You were still evolving.
Still evolving,
yes.
Perfectly. Still evolving. But then I started understanding. I went to a forum that Ayana put on, and there was a judge there, a black man named Leslie, I think it was.
Judge Harris.
Judge Harris.
Yes.
And he was explaining that when he took the bench, it was an unwritten rule that every decision he made would be appealed, even if it was a damn parking ticket. Every decision would be appealed. And it made me realize, and then when I went to other communities, saw you more, I started seeing more, and sadly, you tend to see the same people at these meetings. I mean, I wish there was more interest in all of our sectors. But I think it made me realize that the fight of equity, everything happens at every level. And that's what I was blind to. I could never see past the street level itself. I never knew a Mamleo. I didn't know. I just thought cops. I mean, I remember that incident where the cops beat up that cop in Mattapan years ago and stuff like that. But it was interesting to me that there was a fight within that I never was privy to. Because anytime that I was being arrested, they were certainly in unity against me. So it was interesting. And I just, something that I try to promote to young people, anybody that I can get to listen is look, my experience with the police growing up were adversarial. It's just what it was. It was a different time. It was a different mindset of police and us. Like, we used to get beat up all the time. We used to get stripped naked in the hallway all the time. This was what happened. It would not happen now. And that's what I'm always interested in. But what I do see happening now, it's more of like a mind war game, as opposed to, you don't have to worry about being physically hurt. You almost just have to worry about not being considered, which hurts more. Which hurts more.
It's tough. I think policing is probably the hardest job. And I say this because I was a social worker. I worked at DYS. I worked as a probation officer. I worked in New York in the legal system. I worked for the Bar Association, having gone to law school. I think this is one of the toughest jobs because you respond to situations, and we talked about this earlier, and you have very little context for who this person is. You get like maybe 10 lines on your computer as to what's happened, and you have to deal with the situation. And oftentimes you deal with enough of those situations, you deal with a small sector of the population. It's important
Excuse me.
that you not frame your vision of the world through the lens of that 10% or 8% that you deal with.
How hard is that?
It's incredibly hard.
Right now we're at Roxbury Court. It's an open air drug market in Dudley. And I have so much love for the people in the struggle. At the same time, I don't want you shooting up in front of my kid when I'm walking by. And it creates that kind of split where it's like, I want you to get help, but at the same time, I'm slowly building an anger towards what you're doing.
We do a dirty job, and whether or not people realize this, and I'm not trying to seek any pats on the back or anything along those lines, we deal with the worst sector of, and all the societal ills. We deal with kids who are abused. We deal with women who are abused. We deal with young men and young women who are in the game who are getting shot. We deal with mental health. And a lot of these things, we were not designed to deal with them, but by default, we've learned to deal with them.
What do you mean by not designed?
So initially, when police were created, we were not created to deal with people with mental health.
Initially, police were slave patrols.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're talking about.
I'm just saying, even as it's evolved,
yes,
right? But in today's world, and part of like this idea of community policing, if you read the books, they talk about the police should be kind of like a triage system to get people all these services. But unfortunately, we are not in a place where we're able to get those. The police is probably the only government agency that you can call 24 hours, 7 days a week, and they will respond. And
somebody will respond.
Right? Whether or not they're suited to deal with the situation, we have to find a way to deal with them. So when politicians and community activists say, yes, we want to take some of the things off the police's plate, I welcome it. But for me, it's always about, you know,
which is what I believe defunding means,
yeah,
to be clear,
yeah.
because I absolutely believe the police are necessary. Like, let's just be realistic.
That's the world we live in. So I don't call that defunding. I call it reallocating. But for me, the other piece is there's a little bit of hypocrisy to it, right? Because society as a whole, community activists, politicians, they've all known that there were shortcomings in the education system forever.
I mean, yeah,
right? So now it's as if all eyes are on the police. And again, I want change. I welcome change, you know. And then if you talk to anybody who will tell you, like, I'm that dude, I will readily say, yeah, there's some need for change. But on the other hand, I'm like, okay, we're talking about systemic racism.
Yes.
And I think I saw a thing on your Facebook page last week, and I loved it because at the peak, it said racism, it had the police, and then there was this huge glacier at the bottom. That probably was 20 times, 100 times bigger than it was at the top. So for me, I need to know how we're going to start digging at the root of the problem. And I tell people, like, since George Floyd's murder, we've seen all these major corporations come out and say, we support Black lives. I ask myself, well, how many Black or brown people do you have on your board?
Which is always the...
How much outreach have you done to communities of color? Above and beyond just saying you support Black lives.
Or try to sell your product.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I've questioned a lot of the people who are taking part in these marches. I asked them, where were you last year? Where were you 2 years ago? Where were you 5 years ago? Where will you be next year? Because I know for me, and I don't need to pat myself on the back, I have been actively involved in the community in pushing and helping Black and brown people since I was in college. When I was 19 and 20, I volunteered at the Lucy Stone School. I volunteered at a couple other organizations. I ran a violence prevention program. I ran a tutoring mentoring program. When I went to New York, I did the same thing. So for me, this isn't something new. You know, I think people...
But how'd you decide on law enforcement specifically?
So what happened is when I got out of law school, I worked for a year in New York.
Okay.
And I hated it. I was eating noodles and I think Whoppers at the time. They were 99-cent Whoppers.
Yep, that's exactly what it was.
So, and then I have one of my best friends who actually just recently ran for office, Javon Lissette. We went to undergrad and law school together. And we started talking about how can we really impact and make change. Yeah. So for me, when I went to law school, I thought I was going to be the next Thurgood Marshall and I was going to turn the world upside down.
Okay.
And then you quickly realize there are limitations. So I said to myself, we were both talking, and he said, you know what? We can make a lot of change internally. Change sometimes is best made from the inside. So he convinced me. I took the police exam, and I have to tell you, like, my first month or so on the job, actively getting out the academy, I almost...
Meaning in uniform.
In uniform.
Now you're hired.
Yes.
Got it.
In uniform. And I really considered just walking out the door. There were some things that just made me feel uncomfortable. Little things such as listening to the radio and all day long hearing the description of suspects: black male, blue jeans, white t-shirt, black male. You know, so for me, and it's crazy that I felt uncomfortable with that initially. And I got to a point and I realized...
in the sense of they could have been talking about you.
Absolutely.
Okay. I just wanted to
understand. And I felt like I was part of this system that was kind of like talking about this other group, but here I am, I fit into that group. And it's weird, it's a crazy mind game for me. I don't know that everybody sees it that way. Initially, that's how I saw it, and I was very uncomfortable in that role. You know, but
did you feel like you were selling out? Is that the word to use? Yeah. I'm just trying to figure. I know what you mean.
I don't know that I felt like I was selling out, but
that psychology is probably experienced by a lot of people.
I was like, man, I feel like I'm part of this group. That I just felt odd hearing all these descriptions of black men, and I was one of them, and I just was not comfortable about that. It wasn't like the descriptions were across the board: white, Asian, Hispanic. It was predominantly black men. And
has that changed at all?
I think I'm a lot more comfortable with it.
No, I mean, have the calls you hear
the calls have not changed much. You know, in Roxbury, and and if you talk to a lot of young black and brown men who come into the station, when they see me, they're like, oh.
Yes, because they know you're about to let them know.
I'm like, listen, man, why are you doing this? I said, look at the people that you're victimizing. This is always my question. Like, it's not like you're victimizing people who don't look like you. These are your neighbors.
Let me speak to that. For me personally, why I believe I victimized people that look like me was because I was taught to hate me. So if you look like me, it was natural for me to hate you too.
And I think for me, so that's part of it. And I've actually done a lot of reading and stuff, but most people commit crimes against those who are most likely around them. We don't travel far.
Yes.
So in that way, yes. But I think for me, when I try to get in a lot deeper with some of these young people, when I have conversations, I try to have them understand this, like, this notion that you can't hate those. Like, I don't care if somebody comes to your house and hands you a knife, Christian, say, hey, Christian, go stab your son. Right? At the end of the day, you have a responsibility to your son. That person who comes from the outside, none whatsoever.
Yes, absolutely.
So
absolutely,
we have to teach people to be invested in those who look like them, to value their community, value themselves first and foremost.
Absolutely.
You know, and I think for years, like, at a subconscious, deeply rooted level, we all have some level of psychosis about who we are and how we walk into the world.
And I would say especially black and brown
absolutely,
people.
Absolutely. We have to work hard on that. I remember growing up, and I will openly tell you this, that I had some very difficult times in terms of dealing with how dark I was, right? Because the culture I grew up with always pushed this idea like, hey, you know, the darker you are, the less attractive you are. If your hair is kinky, that's not attractive. It doesn't look good. So I had to deal with those things. And I got to a point, I was like, I'm a good looking dude, right? You get to that point, but it takes a long time.
How old were you when you got to that point?
Probably when I was in college. Yeah. And there's some other reasons behind that, but I think culturally, if you look at most of the places that were colonized, whether it be Africa, the Caribbean, there's always this idea of what is attractive, what's appealing, whether or not you're smart.
If you want to know what I started reading this book about Brazil and the it's not a caste system, but the levels of race and the skin color. And I was really amazed that this shit is everywhere. It is everywhere that
it's outrageous. Look, you go to DR, right? There are some places in DR. I don't care how much money you have. If you're darker, you can't go in there. In Haiti, the system was such that when I grew up in Haiti, the people who tended to be better off, not all of them, tended to be people, what they call them mulattoes.
Yes,
right?
yeah, that's what they,
that's
we
what
don't
use that term anymore.
Mulatto,
yeah. Which, you know, so for me, I grew up in a world thinking like, and you know, those were people who were attractive. Those were the people who had money.
Naturally. Yeah. But, and you know what? That's that subtle stuff we were talking about earlier.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then when I came here in the 70s, remember, we still had that whole color system. As recently as the late 80s, I had a friend who went to school at Howard. And there were some fraternities, they would pull out the brown paper bag if you were darker than the brown paper bag. Yeah, you couldn't. So we have all these issues that are ongoing with us, and until we fix them, I don't know how far we can get. Like for me, at the end of the day, we have to push unity. We have to push family, because at the end of the day, so if you don't push family and you don't teach your kids to value themselves, you don't teach them respect, you don't teach them the value of education, you don't teach them structure, you're setting your kid up for failure. And I've seen it all too often, right? Because if not, then you're recreating the cycle. Like if you read Miss Alexander's book.
Of course.
Yeah, so it's a cycle. Like that kid who grows up in a household who's going to bed at midnight, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, are they able to function in school? Absolutely not. Yeah. And inevitably, you know, you get put into one of those special classes. You're surrounded by other people who have similar issues of dysfunction in the home, all
feeding off of each other. I mean, when I think of being in prison, that's when I was in prison. That's what it like. I mean, I can wake up jolly and all that, but it's almost guaranteed by the end of that day, my mood will be ruined because of everything going on. Let me ask, if you could change one thing instantly right now in the department, what would it be?
You know what? I wish that people would understand that there are more things that align us than separate us. And that, I would not just with the department, but with the community at large.
Yes, I like that. I wasn't thinking that sense. Yes.
We find so many ways to separate ourselves. I'm from Humboldt. You're from Annunciation. You're from Heath. Or I'm dark. You're light. I'm Haitian. You're Jamaican. like, stop the BS. There are more, and this sounds really like cliche-ish and like BS, but at the end of the day, there are more things that bring us together than separate us. And if we can come to terms with that, and then the other piece is to have everybody understand that we all understand everybody's has walked through a different path in life, and that, you know, those things to some extent dictate who we are, and to try to deal with people with some level of understanding. Like, I arrest a kid, I get it, I gotta arrest you, you know, unless it's like trespassing. I'm like, listen, just don't do that anymore, right? But at the end of the day, I don't know what that kid's life has been. If you rob somebody, I gotta arrest you, but I don't have to treat you like shit. You know, understand that these are roles that we play. These roles don't define us. You know, we come into these roles that are established or created for us, if you want. Some people want to say these roles are set up by virtue of the society that we grow up in. But those things don't have to dictate how we deal with each other. There's always respect. Understand that you're a black man, I'm a black man. Right? And sometimes, I have to tell you, we lose sight of that. You know, you're a human being, I'm a human being. And for me, in my position as a police officer, people always ask me, like, over the last few months, what's your perspective as a police officer?
Of course.
And I'm like, well, how about my perspective as a black man? Right? And as a black man who's the father of 2 young men who have to go out into the world and deal with all the challenges of being black. So,
how do you, when you hear of a George Floyd, or, I mean, Philando, there's so many names. Yes, countless names. Let's say you're at a police function, or it's after work, you're hanging out with some of your friends, and it's a mixed group, all sorts of colors within the group, and then breaking news, George Floyd. How does that impact you?
I have to tell you, Christian, so when George Floyd came out, somebody sent me the video, and I sat down and watched it with my father, who was 80 years old. He broke down and started crying. And as hardcore as I'd like to think I am, I had tears coming out of my eyes. Some of it just vicariously watching my father, who's an 80-year-old man who's lived through countless experiences. And knowing that that shouldn't have happened. That should not have happened. So for me, like, I'll be the first one to call things out. If it's wrong, it's wrong. You know, but I think some of the things that we have to learn as police officers, and I like some of the stuff they have in this new bill with the duty to intervene. Sometimes you get caught up in where you are and you can't see beyond your current situation. You can't see outside of it. So for me, when I deal with people, I try to see my son, my father, a friend, a cousin in that person. All right, if you can see people, you can see yourself, your family members, and those individuals, you treat them better. As far as a lot of the stuff that's happened in policing, it hurts. It hurts because for me, it hurts as a black man. And then secondly, it hurts because I know that I'm going to be judged by what somebody did 1,000 miles away, 2,000 miles, or 3,000 miles away. Because it's not about Eddie Crispin anymore, right? It's about the cop who wears the uniform. And ultimately, I'm going to be judged by the actions of...
Well, so let me ask then, because I mean, for me, when I was growing up, I just looked at the police as like a much bigger gang than I was. So I had to defer and respect that. I understand why people get mad. I mean, for me, anybody that has the power to take life legally, if that's the way to say it, needs to be sane, needs to be culturally responsive, aware. I mean, however you look, if you can kill someone, then you need to have some real strict guidelines on that. Why is it so difficult for one officer to call out another officer when there's been a clear, egregious misconduct?
So I think the same things that affect people and society at large, with this idea that you want to stand by. People kind of like the same thing that people don't want to call somebody out if they see something happen. But I think we as law enforcement have to do better. We have to do better, and we have to really foster a culture that encourages and almost forces police officers, when you see somebody doing something wrong, to call them out. I know for
me... Is
it
possible truly to do that?
Absolutely it is. We just have to foster a culture that does that. We grew up in a world where from the time that you're little, if you say something, your mother says, stop being a tattletale, right? So this is all part of the evolution of this whole idea. You go from being a tattletale to high school to being a snitch, and you think you're joining a department or a profession that really stands for, you know, loyalty, courage, protection, service. And then you find out there are these little niches of people who engage in behavior that's not consistent with what you were sworn to do. So I think we have to foster a culture. And it's not enough to like make rules. I tell people, we can create all the rules, all the regulations, all the policies, but until we foster a culture that tells people that's not acceptable for you to do that, or that punishes it so harshly that people won't do it, then people will continue to do that.
Well, because I was reading so many, like, anybody in those type of, they get retired, not fired. It's very different.
Yeah, and it all depends who you are. I think there are some things, I think society at large would like to see police officers get fired for everything. And I'm a firm believer in due process. So if you do something wrong, the commissioner or the deputy superintendent shouldn't unilaterally get to tell you that you're fired. So you should have the ability to go through your due process and maybe go before a board, then go before the ultimately a Superior Court judge or Supreme Court judge, because we know individuals, their perspective sometimes is wrong. So all day long, fire people if they do things wrong, but allow them to access all their due process rights. And if ultimately the judge or the Civil Service Commission says, hey, you did this wrong, you deserve to be fired, then so be it. But I think the other piece is we have to make sure that when we punish somebody, if you go home and you beat your wife, God forbid, and the department brings you back and you get 5 days, and I do the same, make sure I get 5 days. You shouldn't get fired and I get 5 days suspension. So for me, that's a big piece. When we talk about equity, it's not just enough to say we're going to fire people. Let's make sure we punish people the same across the board. Like when we talk about in the 90s and 80s, we talk about crack and cocaine, right? There has to be some parallel universe where everybody's treated the same. So absolutely, I am all for punishing people when they deserve it, but we should not have one person who dictates whether or not you get fired. Because we know, I can tell you that if we look at cases, how oftentimes people get different punishment depending on what you look like, your connections, and
when that's a great something comes to mind when you say that. As a black officer or minority officer, does the energy you project onto the community, is that directly affected by what your superiors are projecting onto you?
I think one of the things about policing, and I think if you want to do some stuff, like you go to roll call, you get out. There's a lot of things that you can create. You can create who you are in their uniform. I always tell people the uniform doesn't define you. You bring definition to the uniform. So if you want to go out to the ballpark and there's some downtime and you want to shoot ball with the kids, absolutely. If you want to go to a program and engage kids, absolutely. If you want to walk down Dudley and Nubian Square and you want to do some drug enforcement, that could become who you are. So to some extent, you get to kind of dictate what you want to do. To some extent, there are departmental cultures that exist, and I tell people, if you travel around the country, and I'm not patting Boston on the back because this is who I work for, but you will see different police departments have very different cultures in terms of use of force, how they engage the community, how they do traffic stops, how quickly they pull their guns out. So that each department has its own culture. Like you go to work, your workplace has a culture. It's either it's inviting or it's very separate. People stand out to themselves based on position, based on color. So all these things we have to develop, and in doing so, within the department, it substantially impacts who you are, because you come in out of the academy, you're fresh. You're still developing how you are going to be as a police officer. people, I think, function based on a reward system. If I get to the B2 or C11 or any station and I see, wow, these cops are being rewarded, they're going out, they're shaking hands, they're crossing, they're helping old ladies cross the street, they're reading books to kids and they're getting rewarded, then I'm more likely to fall
I get
into
where
that.
you're going. Okay. And if you happen to be in Nubian Square,
Yeah.
and the culture is to do this to get rewarded, you're going to do that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Do you have any thoughts in terms of when you mentioned the crack era, like, you know, I mean, I will be the first to acknowledge there is definitely an opioid epidemic that exists, no doubt about it. But there was also the 80s and 90s, and there was a crack epidemic that existed, and obviously one's considered a public health crisis, one's considered, you know, a chapter in our history.
Yeah.
Do you see a difference in these two epidemics that doesn't revolve around color?
So I will tell you this. I think when I look at it, I've had this discussion with a couple of friends of mine. I think the level of violence that existed with crack as opposed to, you know, opioids, heroin, is very different. We knew the crack epidemic, violent crime was through the roof. And again, we had this discussion earlier. I don't know if society is so much more conscious about societal issues and how to deal with them, or this is just a clear case of people looking at situations based on color and who the users are.
Yes.
So maybe it's a little bit of both. I think there were a lot of people of color who really pushed this agenda of really harsh punishment for people who were involved in the crack epidemic in the 80s and 90s. So to say that this was something that's just purely a factor of color, I don't know. I know people who lived in communities that were just decimated by violent crime and who were pushing for police to arrest people and incarcerate people. And so I'd like to think that we're a little bit more evolved, but I think there's a little bit of also of some biases based on color that help you know, create that culture of, you know, harsh punishment for those who were involved.
Do you think that we're still feeling the ramifications of the crack epidemic?
I think so. I think I see a lot of young parents now who grew up in households that were very dysfunctional. And for me, just based on my social work background, I worked with a lot of families who had those issues. So for me, I think about if you were 18 or 19 in the 90s and you were still just in general. If you're 16, 17, 18, 19, you have a kid, when you're that age, you're still rebelling against your parents. And we talk about brain development, right? You still haven't learned how to value those things that
So you
really
believe
matter.
that the brain develops in...
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I had a conversation with
good to hear
the
you
DA
say
the
that.
other day, and I told her, I said, if it was up to me, we wouldn't hire anybody under 25 to be a police officer.
Interesting.
I'll put that
I've
out.
never heard that before.
For
Interesting.
me, I think that should be the case, but you think about it, 16, 17, 18, 19, most of us are still rebelling against our parents.
Yes.
You have a kid, what are you teaching your kid? Not those things that are geared towards raising a self-sufficient, structured,
absolutely,
well-mannered, respectable person. Because I've seen, so when I worked for DSS, I remember there was an era like towards close to the late 80s, like mid 90s, where I saw a lot of young black men, young brown men walking with their kids. They were taking ownership, right? And sometimes you don't know why these things happen, but there are slight cultural shifts. And I was like, man, that's a good thing. But by the same token, this little 17-year-old man, he was talking to his son and he's talking to his boy. He's telling his boy, tell that N, F you.
Of course,
right?
Of course.
So it's double-sided. We're
They're
taking
doing
ownership.
what they know at that
you're doing
moment.
what you know. So that kid who grows up in that environment, you inevitably teach your kids what you know. And for me, I'd like to see what percentage of people are able to escape those situations, mature into, you know, responsible, self-sufficient, productive members of society.
Absolutely.
You know, and I think you could clearly find a correlation between those who grew up in those homes and those who don't. And I'm not saying that's all that creates the person, because we know people who grew up in very functional homes, two parents with decent incomes, and who come out all messed up.
Yes, absolutely. So last question, what is your understanding of a mentor and are mentors important?
Absolutely. And so it all depends who the mentor is.
Yes.
Right?
Healthy mentor.
Yeah, healthy mentors. And because we can be a mentor, I can be a mentor, but is that person really ready to receive the information I'm giving them? Right? You can take the horse to the water, you can't force them to drink. And I think it's important that you have mentors in your life. I know for me, the information that you're able to pass on could substantially impact and dictate where a person lands in life. I know for me, from an academic standpoint, I've had some mentors, and I have other people who I just talk to who are life mentors.
Yes.
Who talk to you about relationships, who talk to you about uplifting yourself, uplifting your community. So I think one mentor is good, but the more people that you can connect yourself to who are doing positive things, so I always encourage kids, surround yourself with people who are doing positive things.
Yes.
You'll find that you're more likely to engage in positive activities.
Absolutely. A matter of fact, it was a long time ago I was having a call, but my uncle and I were talking, and he was like, you know, the same way you ended up sitting with the F students was that it could have been by accident, choice, whatever, but it could have just as easily been you sitting with the A students.
Yeah. And
just as easy.
It can dictate where you end up. I have a friend of mine who was involved in education, and they did this experiment with kids. So, you know, there's an advanced class, there's an intermediate class, and there's a class that's a little lagging. They did an experiment. They told the kids who historically had been in the low performing class, so you guys are now the advanced class. And their performance directly...
just by the encouragement itself.
Just by telling them, you're now the smart class. So I think all those things, but for me, at the end of the day, the home is where it all starts.
Yeah.
You know, we can send our kids to the best schools, but if they're coming back to a dysfunctional situation, you spend 6 hours at home, at school, 6-7 hours, you come back to 12 hours of dysfunction and hell. I don't know.
The home's gonna win 99% of the time. Exactly. And it's interesting you say that. So when I came home from prison, the last and final time, I was 35. I hit the ground running with learning how to be a parent. I never learned. I was learning how to be a parent. And what I noticed was there's no services for somebody like me. And, you know, if you're not 26 or under, and most is 25 and under, and it occurred to me that so many programs are designed to wrap around the kid, but not the parent as well. And then they put a lot of money into this kid and then send them back home. And then that kid stays in that system in a loop for so many years. And my proposal sometimes when I talk to politicians and stuff, I'm like, look, I know in your mind, I made choices that I had to, fine. I could bring up all of these laws and policies and my past experience of being abused, and I could give you a million reasons why I did what I did. Fine, none of those are acceptable, fine. But my son is now 13 at the age I was when I entered into everything. So I'm looking, you don't have to help me, help him. But the way to help him is to help me. Because in my mind, if we can heal parents, half of these systems are knocked out in a generation or two.
And I think, unfortunately, by the time these systems are able to touch these kids, they're further along. I think the first time that they're able to see what a kid's going through,
couldn't agree more,
is in school. And I think we have some barriers that our system places in terms of really trying to get at parents and helping them. So I think our system of the Constitution, the liberties we have, kind of limits how quickly you can get onto somebody's house. But I wish there was something that people would readily accept, right? And how many people, even when they're 35, are willing to acknowledge, like, look, I need some help parenting.
Yes. Something that I'm really big on is, like, where we talked about words, like the word Tory and stuff. So the first thing I tend to ask a young father or a young mother, what is a mother or father to you? Because so many people have a generalized understanding, but it means different things to everybody. And I always try to establish that sort of baseline, because I tell people, I was raised to be the N-word. I was raised to be a savage, and I was very good at it. Within that definition, there wasn't a definition for a father, a brother, a nephew, a son. These roles were non-existent. And I didn't learn what a father was until I was in my 30s. You know, I'm 41 now, and it is.
I have this conversation with kids at the Teen Police Academy. It's called Stereotypes and Personal Responsibility, right? And one of the things I put different images, I put different words, and I put images of all the different things that it means to be a woman, a man, a father. You know.
That sounds like this Harvard study. You ever heard of the IET test? Implicit association test? That's what that sounds like. Okay, okay.
You know, we grow up thinking that we know what these things mean, but we really don't.
Like, don't.
And I liken it to when people tell you they love you. Like, okay, what does that mean to you?
And the biggest thing that I was always told that I never questioned until I understood was when everyone on the block would always be like, "You're crazy."
Yeah, that was a good thing.
It was a good thing. Without question. I didn't question it. I never understood what they meant by it. I ended up assigning that they meant be more violent. That's how
that's good. That's good.
That's a good thing. But it was like when you start to truly see how this plays into your own personal identity, you better start questioning these words. You better start questioning these words.
It goes so far deeper than that. Like, just look at the way we engage with each other, you know, like with the N-word, you know, you my nigga.
Yes,
and,
absolutely.
Like, even with young people, like, you my bitch. Like, do you understand the impact that's having on you?
Yes.
You know, the one good thing I will say, because I'm one of those people, I like to watch trends.
Yes.
When I was going out a few years ago, most of these kids were like, yo, that's my nigga. And I notice now, they're like, bro.
Yes.
I might, sometimes it's annoying, but I'd rather accept that.
I feel like that's part of for me, that's like a harm reduction theory.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you.
Yes.
I agree with you.
I couldn't agree more.
I like to follow these little trends. I'm like, okay, this is what's happening now. And sometimes you have to wonder, like, how did we get there? How did we make that change? You know, how did we go from being...
That's actually, I'm going to look into that. I never really thought about that. That's actually, you're right about that.
You got to think about it. And, you know, for me, I think about, like, how black men used to be. What's going on, man?
Yes,
and I always say, you know why? Because a lot of those men grew up in a time
where they were taught they weren't men.
Well, you weren't, and people would refer to you as boys. So it was kind of like me uplifting you by saying, what's up, man? You know, so
that's actually fascinating. I love thinking about stuff like that. The
all these things, they don't just happen by mere coincidence.
Never.
There's always something that happens. There's always a little societal shift, something that happens that causes us to change our language, how we engage each other, what we do, how we walk out into the world. You know, so absolutely.
Well, this was a pleasure. This was a milestone for me.
Listen, I appreciate
no,
you.
No.
You know how long ago we talked?
I know.
And we never did, but listen, man.